What we're doing today is I want to talk about shadow pattern in paintings. And I've got some images, some paintings from artists we're going to look at and talk about as examples to see how they used shadow pattern. Artist we're going to look at mainly is Frank Brangwyn, probably mispronouncing his name, but he was a Welsh painter, early 20th century. And we're going to look at some of his drawings and his color sketches. Also, Edward Compton, or to be more exact, Edward Theodore Compton. There's a Edward Harrison Compton also, and they're father-son painting team. I forget which one's the father, which one's the son. They both paint really similar. Really good painters. Again, early 20th century, more late 19th maybe. Then a couple from Frederick Malhaupt and Richard Parks Bonington. And they all have different ways of painting, different ways of using values and the shadow pattern. But we'll look at how they did it and how they use that to make their paintings a lot more effective. But when I say shadow pattern, let me clarify what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily just the shadow side of an object, whether you're painting a still life or a landscape or a figure. What I'm talking about is that overall dark pattern that flows through the painting or flows through your subject, and how we use that. We really need to emphasize it. And it gives our painting more of an abstract quality that allows us to compose better, suggest the light better. So there's three things that the shadow pattern is really helpful for. First one is it really helps to simplify our subject. When we're looking at a complicated landscape, or again, still life or figure painting, the shadow pattern helps simplify it, because when you look for the shadow pattern, you're putting everything either into the shadow side or the light side. No halftones, no middle values, no subtle value changes. It's either dark or light. And that simplifies what we're looking at quickly. And I'll show you some of those. The other thing it does, it helps us to set up the composition. And I've got some things here. A couple of my thumbnail drawings that I'm using. You can see the photograph on the left. This is my shadow pattern in the drawing on the right. And again, it simplifies my subject because I'm forcing everything, all these little rocks, little leaves, little detail, everything kind of makes it more complicated. The shadow pattern simplifies. I've got everything either a dark or a light. And these are small thumbnail drawings. I usually do 2 or 3 before I do a painting to kind of work out the best composition. So it simplifies. It also sets up the composition, because my composition is composed of the dark shape. So I can make sure I have good balance with the dark shape, make sure nothing's centered. Another one here is this Salt River Canyon. Again, all I've drawn is the shadow pattern. And if I can get this shadow pattern down on the canvas, that makes my drawing of what I'm looking at a lot easier. I mean, we can look at the reference on the left and really get caught up in all the little details in the shadow and the stuff in the background and the shrubbery. But if all I'm looking for is that shadow pattern, and I work that out in a small thumbnail first, it makes the painting a lot easier. And again, I can set up the composition that way. The last thing the shadow pattern does, and this is my take, I'm sure artists out here think of different ways that it really helps your painting, but the third one for me is if I can establish this big shadow pattern in my painting and then keep that contrast pretty strong throughout the whole painting, I'm always going to have the right value contrast to suggest the light. And of course, this is a real sunny day. It's easier to see that strong contrast. with the strong shadow and strong sunlight, but even on a cloudy day, which we'll talk about in a minute. So again, 3 things. It simplifies my subject. I've got to force everything into a simple dark or a simple light, no halftones. It helps me set up the composition easier because I'm composing with this shadow pattern. And then lastly, it establishes that strong value contrast that's going to suggest the light. Because even as I paint into my drawing on the canvas and I start seeing more subtle values in the shadow, I still want to keep that separation. Obviously it won't be as much because I'll be adding some lighter darks, but I'm still wanting to keep that strong contrast. So let's look at some shadow patterns from some drawings and paintings from Frank Brangwyn. Again, he was known, I think, mainly as a mural painter. I know he had some influence on Dean Cornwell, and you'll see that when you look at his paintings. But this is a thumbnail sketch he did for a crucifixion, and while there's no detail per se, and he's not necessarily concerned about proportion and really correct drawing, but what he is getting is this shadow pattern in here. And you can see it kind of runs its course along in here. Up in here it goes up these shadowed arms, down here up the cross, and then around again. He can set up his composition so much easier thinking in terms of that shadow pattern. And he can change it. He can change the shapes, lean the darks or lights one way or the other. I've got several of his drawings and or etchings here. This is an etching of his. And you can see the strong pattern of dark and light. I mean, this is a finished drawing, a finished etching. But the main thing here is that strong contrast of dark and light, and it sets up everything. A very abstract looking painting with this diagonal of kind of a half tone and then the light against the dark shapes and the weight on one side, weight a little less on the other. This obviously is not a thumbnail or a preparatory drawing or anything. It's a finished etching, but you can see how he's using the shadow pattern all the way up to the end. That makes a really strong composition and strong value contrast. Again, here the shadow pattern, the dark of the trees, the dark of the shadow on the right side of the bridge here, and then the dark underneath. All that shadow pattern goes to set off the bridge, that light of the bridge. And as he's thinking shadow pattern, because I know exactly what Frank Brangwyn was thinking back in 1905, he's not thinking necessarily to start with how to render these leaves or branches or trunks or how to show the texture on the bridge. What he's thinking of is just dark shape against light shape to set up the simplicity of the subject, to work out the composition, and to get that strong contrast. And if you can keep that throughout the whole painting, it's really going to work, or in this case, etching. But you can see again how the shadow pattern sets this up. Very shadow pattern oriented. He doesn't really go back into that shadow and add any value variation. It's just real strong dark, real strong light. I mean, then there's the subtle stuff in the distance here, but very strong. So much easier to set up the composition with just a strong shadow pattern. These are some color sketches by Frank Brangwyn. I think most of these are from Venice. But I really like his paintings. I mean, there's no subtlety anywhere, not much subtle color, and no subtle values. And while there's a lot going on in the shadow, you see a lot of value changes in the boats and the figures, some value changes in the buildings, but not too much. That shadow pattern remains really strong. He doesn't mess it up with a lot of detail and a lot of halftones or halftone darks. The darks stay pretty dark, even though there's some value change. But if we look at the shadow pattern here, I just emphasized the shadow pattern with black. He really makes that real evident, and you can see the whole composition rests upon where he places the shadow pattern. So if you can simplify your subject with the shadow pattern, then take that shadow pattern and adjust it to design your composition, it's a lot easier than to try and do it with a bunch of lines and little shapes. You can set up the weight distribution a lot easier with just shadow pattern, those big, simple dark and light shapes. And then keeping that contrast throughout the whole painting really helps suggest the light. And he does a lot of these. Again, they're somewhat similar. And he's very eclectic in the subject matter and the palette he uses. A lot of different colors, color palettes and subject matter. But very strong, simple stuff here. And again, that shadow pattern, similar to the last one. I like this little silhouetted area back in here. Just simple, dark, and light. You don't have to break things up with a lot of detail. And that's the problem with photographs, especially these digital cameras. They break up our big dark and light areas so much. In fact, I almost prefer the early digital, where everything was kind of pixely and you couldn't see any detail, but you could really see the shadow pattern real well. And here's the shadow pattern. Again, very strong. If you can nail this first before you start color and design your painting with this shadow pattern, your painting goes so much easier. And not easy, but more simple. Painting's never easy, but it can be more simplified. And I think that's the goal. If nothing else, I've learned over the years, decades, that simplicity is really the key to painting. I used to think if I can make things look complicated, it must be a good painting, but simplicity is the key. And another one of his, again, very strong shadow pattern. You don't have to do much inside the shadow pattern to make it really work. It's got some value changes. And again, shadow pattern, designing that. And again, doing small thumbnail drawings of these shadow patterns before painting. And that's all you have to do. Again, just find the shadow pattern. And here's the shadow pattern here. Again, really simplifies. And this is not an easy subject. It's complicated, perspective, linear perspective. Shadow shapes can be complicated. But if you look at the shadow shapes as a large mass and grouping, again, like that, becomes so much easier. I can draw this on the canvas a lot easier than I could draw the original scene, trying to sort through all the detail and the lines and big mass. Again, here's the shadow pattern here. So much easier. Now this is Richard Parkes Bonington. He was an early 1800s British painter. Very subtle values here. The shadow pattern is not nearly as strong as Frank Brangwyn, but it's still there. He still uses it. You can see how he's setting up the composition. Viewer's eye comes in at the bottom here. Usually starts at the bottom, winds around and back around. You can emphasize the kind of the dark in the clouds and picking it up again back in there. And not that the viewer knows what the heck he's doing. People don't walk into a museum and know how they're supposed to look at a painting. But I think naturally we tend to enter a painting at the bottom. So most of these paintings, the shadow pattern kind of starts at the bottom and winds its way through the composition. And the more it winds through, kind of meanders, the more you keep the viewer's eye in the painting. If it's too much of, just a straight path to the focal point, you're not going to look at the painting very long. You're going to get to the focal point quickly and then move on to the next painting. So using that shadow pattern to really meander through. Now this is Compton, Edward Theodore, and it's a watercolor. And this one, really subtle. And it's hard to pick up any pattern. But it's a subtle subject in that it's cloudy, there's fog all over the place. But there is still a shadow pattern here. And if he's not seeing it this way first, again, viewer's eye kind of picks up a little bit darker edge of the cattle and the grass that's darker, winding along the shadows in the mountains and going all over the place in here and then kind of wind back out again. The more you can see that, the better. Now he does break those shadow patterns up with a lot of lighter value. So it's real subtle. And there's something about a more subtle shadow pattern, like this one, very subtle. This one is not. That's not a subtle shadow pattern. But this one is subtle. And there's something about subtlety, but still able to grab your eye and pull you along. That's really good. George Ennis was real subtle with his compositions and setting things up and moving your eye through. And so was Edward here in this composition. Okay, now here is Frederick Mulhaupt, kind of a late 19th, early 20th century East Coast painter. Cape Ann, Gloucester, those areas. Very strong design. And again, he sets it up with shadow pattern. Now, his shadow pattern is broken up quite a bit with these lighter shadows, but they are shadow, they are darks. And when you can design your painting with bigger dark and light, in other words, this is more complicated to look at and paint because it has all the details back in here, all the details in the foreground, even in the background, full of detail. But if I can look at it this way first, just a shadow pattern of everything either dark or light, it's easier to lay in the composition in large abstract masses than it is to try and render a boat or 25 houses in the background. So finding a way to simplify is such an important part of it. This is another one of his here. I really like this one. This, again, cloudy day, no cast shadows to speak of, but the shadow pattern is the dark water against the snow, the dark vertical shapes of the boats and the buildings against the sky and the lighter sails. And you can see how it flows. Even before I outline the shadow pattern, you can really see how the viewer's eye kind of flows along that dark pattern. Here's the dark pattern. Just a lot of different ways to move into the painting and flow throughout the whole thing. You don't have to worry about drawing all these, whatever these dock things are called, these pillars or little details on the boat. I mean, all that is added at the very end of the painting. You want to work with this big dark and light pattern, this big shadow pattern for as long as possible before you start breaking it up. Getting the right value relationships as you break up that shadow pattern into subtle value changes. And even if he didn't add any of these details in here, it'd still be a real nice painting if he just eliminated all the details in the dock and the masts and everything. It's just a great abstract design. And I think it all starts again with that shadow pattern.